and I believe I've sent the slides over previously so that they can be posted to the website. And I look forward to both hearing back from everyone in the Q&A, but also moving into some online discussions afterwards, since now we're all getting very good at the online world. So I really want to thank you all for letting me join you. This is a really exciting conference for me because of not only the advances we've seen on the scientific side, but for the advances on the policy side. And so my title is very ambitious, and the question is really, have we reached peak carbon emissions? And for those of you who are tired, I've summarized the whole talk underneath. And the answer shouldn't surprise you, only if we act on the promises we've made. And that really will sum up what I think I'm going to highlight today. And so if anyone wants to access my laboratory website, it's RAIL, Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. .berkeley.edu, very easy to find here. For those of you who use Twitter, I'll certainly tweet at least one thing from this conversation. And for WeChat, it's at the bottom. And so we start off in my physics side of my life. That's where I did all my degrees in physics. And we look at the climate scenarios. And of course, everyone at this conference, whether you work on the topic or not, you've seen versions of these cases, the business as usual 5 degrees or more scenario cases, the world of 3 or 4 degrees, and then our objective is the wrong word. It's our imperative. We must get to this range down here for ecological, for human health, for planetary sanity. And unfortunately, our path has diverged from this very, very hopeful point in 2014, when the US and Chinese presidents met and essentially decided on a G2 of climate. Of course, the US and China being the largest consumers of energy, the largest emitters of greenhouse gases. This was a historic day. And with all deference to my friends in Europe, I don't believe the Paris Climate Conference would have come up with such aggressive goals if this handshake, if this dialogue hadn't happened. And I was very pleased. I served in the Obama administration. I was honored to be part of this team. And all of you know the simplified version, that 4.5 degree pathway. And then what happened in Paris because of the diversifying of the agreement, the belief that President Obama and President Xi and many European leaders and others shared, that if we all make commitments, we could essentially cut the problem in half. That's what we saw here. The red on this graph shows the commitments we made in Paris in 2015. And of course, these are now called the National Direct Commitments, and they carved off about 1 degree of warming. That is absolutely fabulous. So in this talk, I want to also talk about honoring these commitments, the unfortunate path the US has taken, that Brazil's taken, but also the gray. The gray is the needed innovations, and I'll come back to that in a bit. And that's why I think that science and innovation and engineering and moving those into policy is going to be so critical. But it's a little better than that seems, because right after Paris, Secretary of State John Kerry and others signed a global new agreement, the Kigali Accords, that are mainly for industrial uses, and they would shave off about another half a degree. And so this more or less did split the problem in half. And if we had stuck to our commitments, that would be great. At this point in time, only 2 countries are on pace to meet those targets. It's not Denmark, it's not Germany, it's not China, of course it's not the United States. It's 2 African countries. The Gambia and Morocco are on pace for their targets. No one else is there. And that's really why I say if we stick to our commitments, we have a chance. So those commitments, of course, were for 2 degrees. And since then, the science is very clearly spoken that we're going to have to do far more. The 1.5 degree target that we know we need to get makes this even more stringent. And so that's really the question. Can we make that? Well, as SK said very kindly, my laboratory works in partnership with a number of groups. This is just a collage of images from our partnerships in China with former Minister Wang Gan, with colleagues at Tsinghua and North China Power University, at the State Grid Center, with the Chinese negotiators, to really work on how we can get there together. And it's really that faster together path that my science points me very clearly to. So just to drive home how critical that half degree is, when we look at what we expect right now the damages would be in terms of heat and sea ice and species loss, you can see it's generally a factor of 2 to 10 worse if we only hit our 2-degree target, which many reasonable skeptics think will be difficult. So this 1.5 really becomes critical. And that's why establishing zero carbon mandates in the future is so critical. So when we think this through, a paper that's been widely cited, Cristina Figueres, who was the chair of Paris meeting, was the lead author. I'm a signatory on this paper. My governor at the time, Governor Brown in California, also signed onto this paper. And really, this tells the physics story in a beautifully scary way. Not only does it show our increase in emissions, you see the tan line here, but each year of delay doesn't just mean our peak is higher. It means from a physics perspective, the slope of our decarbonization line must be steeper. If we started in 2016, this blue line is 3% average annual decarbonization. The orange line is 4%. The red line is 5%. And I mention those as guardrails because, as I'll show shortly, we have briefly hit 3%. We have never seen 4% nor 5%, and we've never seen it sustained for decades. So this is really the challenge that science must bring together. So in a recent paper, Amory Lovins from the Rocky Mountain Institute and myself and other colleagues highlighted this. Back in the 1980s, our peak rate of global decarbonization was just over 1%. Increased efforts in Europe, in China, in the United States at the time doubled that effort until a peak in 2015 when the world hit almost 3%. And I say we hit that for 1 year, not sustained for 30. And then the bad behavior in the United States, the bad behavior in Brazil, the bad behavior elsewhere means we've relaxed back to those 1980 levels. This is scientifically, ecologically, ethically unacceptable. We have to rebound to our higher rates and now sustain them. So it's a mixture of policy and new science and innovation. And of course, when we look at what COVID has done, for all of the horrible disaster, it at least shows us something positive. This is the NOx emissions over China before the Wuhan lockdown, and then at the peak of the lockdown, where pollution levels dropped by more than 50%. Now, COVID is not a way to reduce emissions, but it highlights the level of change that's possible. In fact, in a recent paper with colleagues at Tsinghua in Germany and elsewhere, we looked at the rate of greenhouse gas emissions. The top dashed line for each country in each curve is 2019, and 2020 is the lower curve. And you can see that globally, we have seen about 6%. China did better at about 10%. US, of course, did more poorly at about 4%. And that would be good news because it shows the sensitivity. In fact, coal use dropped by 10%, natural gas by 4%, and renewable energy use went up by 3%. This is global. Each percentage on the global basis is a big deal. If we had sustained those cuts, that would be fabulous news. What we're seeing, however, and this is a paper that just appeared 2 days ago in Science, shows that over China, NOx, CO2 emissions have essentially come back to their pre-lockdown levels. So we have rebounded in the bad direction. That means that the policies, the technology options we work on today are going to have to go much, much faster. There is incredible good news. Let me switch to the United States, the worst outlier under the last 4 years of bad behavior. When we look at the cost of clean energy across our country, this shows the least cost technology. Natural gas is in rust color here. Wind is in green and solar is in purple. You can see solar mainly in the Southwest is the least cost, and right where I live in San Francisco. Well, this is at no dollars a ton as the price of carbon. In California, we live under a $20 price of carbon. This shows the dramatic expansion of purple, of solar, the dramatic reduction in natural gas as the least cost technology. Wind stays about the same. There's a small pocket where nuclear is the least cost. And I'm using a calculator based at the University of Texas, of course, a gas-dominated state. $20 is our California price, but economists think that the social cost of carbon is actually $50. Now, no one in the United States is proposing this yet. No one in China is proposing this yet. But if I use $50, you can see that natural gas is essentially gone. This is a United States dominated for new investments by solar and wind, and that pocket of nuclear remains. But this is the hopeful sign, and that is, of course, what technology has got us to. One of the worries about this natural gas world, however, is that we know that fugitive emissions from gas, from fracked gas, from old wells is significant. There are many papers highlighting that the emissions from gas are so large in the life cycle that in many cases, natural gas plants can approach coal plants for their damage. It's a hugely important problem under discussed. So I've just mentioned carbon pricing. This is a global map showing the places that have carbon prices, such as California, such as the hubs in China. We're waiting for the Chinese national market to begin. It highlights mainly the European prices, led by Sweden. But if we do not move our policies to catch up with these technologies, we won't be able to make good on these types of cuts. Now, here in California, our plan is to be carbon negative by 2045. So that would mean, yes, in California, we have peaked our carbon emissions. So my title is valid for my home state, the world's 5th largest economy. And just recently, you might have seen that California has said that we are outlawing the sale of internal combustion vehicles by 2035. My goal is to make it earlier than 2035. And this is what our governor announced just 2 months ago. Well, that was an announcement in September. It was followed the next day by the premier in China announcing again that China would peak its emissions by 2030 and would become net zero, as you were talking about in the last session, by 2060. My hope for California is that we can meet our 2045 goal early, and that in China we can move that 2060 goal earlier, both of which will be challenges for very different reasons. In fact, if we look at the Tsinghua model, the Chinese official model essentially for emissions, it does show a peak in 2030, and it shows a gradual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. But I want to caution everyone that the Chinese 2060 pathway, of which I love this as a goal, counts very strongly on negative emissions, both carbon capture and storage and by natural uptake. And I'm exceedingly worried, in fact, skeptical, I would say, of goals that rely this heavily on CCS, whether they're in China or the United States. And it's not because CCS can't work. It's because the costs and the reliance on nature-based solutions is something I want to see, but I worry that in an increasingly dense urbanized world, these challenges will really be severe. So we look forward, what are the positive signs? President-elect Biden has done better than California. He has said for the US, the plan is now to become energy carbon neutral by 2035, and critically to direct 40% of the funds to disadvantaged communities, something I'll come back to in a little bit. President-elect Biden has also said that he'll catalyze this with $2 trillion in federal spending and $5 trillion in total with the money from the private sector. And that's great, although we still have to remember that globally, our fossil fuel subsidies led by the United States and China are massive. They're larger than this on an annual basis. So we're going to have to not only ramp up the science and technology, but also reorient our economies. President-elect Biden has also said that climate justice, investing in the poorest communities, will be central to his plan. And of course, on day one, we'll re-enter the Paris Climate Accords. So with that exciting set of news, the picture of the world is very different if we keep our promises. This shows for each sector of the world, in terms of coal and solar deployment, GDP, CO2 emissions, how much of the world will now be under regimes with zero carbon policies. And I'm counting the United States in blue for President-elect Biden. I'm counting China with their 2060 goal. And so what this says is that we can no longer claim this is someone else's problem. Yes, we have the gray at the top, led by countries that have not yet made commitments. But we have an increasing set of countries, now including Japan and South Korea, that have committed. So we are on a policy path. It's our job in the scientific and technical and economic community to make good on that. This is where I would love to end our talk. This takes into account those commitments made in China, in the United States. And it highlights that unlike the current policies that would not keep warming low enough, that would keep warming by under 3 degrees, that our optimistic case, if the US and China and others meet their goals, we have a chance now to be on a 2-degree pathway. That's not good enough for 1.5, but this is dramatically different based on the recent commitments made by China and by President-elect Joseph Biden. So this is the point when I have to swear, and I hope you've all seen the movie The Martian. The most important line in that movie, this pardon my one swear word in this talk, is that after our astronaut discovers himself alone on Mars, he says, I'm going to have to science the shit out of this. And this, I think, is the line that we have to take to heart. We know Neil Tyson, one of our most famous science communicators, says my favorite line in the movie is, we're going to science the blank out of it. That's what needs to happen over the next few years. We need to recognize and accelerate things like Moore's law, the learning curve, or the price of solar, due to innovations on the science side and demand pull in the biggest markets and production in the biggest production sites like in China and Malaysia, Germany, and the United States, have caused this steady price decline. It's been dramatic. It has to continue. And for those of you who think, well, solar is already as cheap as it can get, this is not even true. This is just a snapshot of new material science innovations, from transparent solar, so office buildings can generate solar from the windows, to photovoltaics, to thin film and wearable solar. All of these are the technological things that we all have to not only develop in the lab, but bring incredibly quickly to the market if we want to go ahead. And we need that demand pull. Here in California, it's now illegal after the 1st of this year to build a home that does not generate as much energy as it consumes. And here's a picture of a new housing development built in Southern California earlier this year. And you can see multifamily homes with solar, single family homes with solar. This is now the law of the land in California. It's something I hope that will come to the United States overall in the coming years. It's a great start. That learning curve I showed for solar, showing that slope of these lines, remember this is in log space, so it's a power law. We also see it for energy storage. Here we have lithium ion. Here in purple, we have flow batteries. We have exciting innovations in the material science and the function of storage that we have to move aggressively to market. We need to continue this science-based process, but we now need to move things into operation in the real world much faster than we're used to. So we're going to have to science the blank out of it, and we're going to have to deploy the blank out of it if we're going to make these goals happen. But thankfully, the economics is on our side to do that. Here in California, only 5 years ago, we were worried about what we call the duck curve. This is the demand during the day in California. Remember, we're the 5th largest economy. It shows the demand is flat in the middle of the night and peaks a little bit in the afternoon, and then really goes up in the later afternoon, evening, when businesses and homes are on. Well, as we deploy more and more solar, California, we have 1 million solar rooftops in our state. Our net demand goes down and down. It gets hollowed out by all that solar. That means the marginal cost, the marginal value of solar drops. So we were worried about this curve. We should not have been, because now we see this very differently. Here's the same curve, but we look at that low-cost solar during the day and those low-cost batteries as a way to store it, to use it in the evening, and to smooth over the neck of that curve when the demand ramps up so dramatically. So science and material science and deployment has given us options to think very differently about what at one point seemed like an overgeneration. That's a great start, but it's only a start. Here is a flow battery power plant deployed in California to meet our regulation that we have 2% of our peak demand available in storage. You see it's solar powered. These are 2 large flow batteries, giving us a 1/4 megawatt of production with a 4-hour storage time. This is a requirement to play in the California market, and we're going to need to see innovations like this, putting cutting edge technologies like flow batteries in operation very quickly to play a role. Well, I showed you those single family homes, but of course, most of us work in office buildings, and across much of the world, particularly in Asia, we live more in high-rise buildings than those low-rise buildings. So that 2020 goal for California, to have all of our single family and multifamily homes being net zero, is not good enough. California also passed a law that says by 2030, all of our high-rise buildings must be net zero. Now, we don't know how to do this today economically. We could do it technically with heat pumps, thin film solar on the windows, batteries in the basement, but making this economically viable is the primary challenge of this coming decade. We must move these ideas far more quickly into practice. That's where science, engineering, economic colleagues all have to bring these to their local markets so that we can move ahead more rapidly. So one example is one of my proud collaborations in China. This is our team from Tsinghua, from Chongqing University, from Renmin University, from North China Power University, working on a project to look at massive vehicle electrification. In this effort, what we've done is starting off as a partnership with the city of Shenzhen. And this is actually the project that SK mentioned. Our former shared student, Cheng Zheng, or Andy Zheng, as he likes to call himself when he's in Berkeley, was one of my PhD students. He actually was a PhD student between myself and the person who I suspect will become the next Secretary of Energy in the United States. I don't know for sure, but I suspect a good friend of mine will be that secretary. And what we were asked by Shenzhen was to help them with a program to electrify 100% of their taxi fleet. And as of today, I can report it's been quite successful. Shenzhen is over 95% electric taxis. Here's one of the ceremonies to hand the EV taxis to their drivers. And in Shenzhen, the etiquette is that you turn over your car to the next driver fully charged. That is where our team, based here at Berkeley and based at a company in Chengdu, came together to work with Shenzhen. They provide us the data from each taxi every 5 minutes, so we know location, velocity, and state of charge for each vehicle. And immediately the city had a problem. This video shows those taxis queued up. You can see this is actually video. The cars on the main road are moving, the taxis are not. This is pulling into a charging station so they can turn over their taxis to the next driver fully charged. We studied the charging routines. We looked at when they were queued up, when there were available charging stations, and of course found that there were bottlenecks, not only at the biggest charging stations, but also when the shift change happens. So like all things these days, we built an app. This is the app that shows the charging station availability. You can see the EVs here under the charging bay. And what we provided was real-time data for which charging stations had spaces available and which didn't, and worked with the municipal government so that what they could do is to build more charging at the critical locations, but also work with them so that on the critical roads, we could begin to invest in inductive on-road charging. That is sciencing the blank out of it. We need to find those bottlenecks, build charging at those stations. We have similar stories and challenges here in California. As I said, internal combustion vehicle sales will be outlawed after 2035. And one of the things that I've been working on is this social justice angle. The lowest income people around the world commute the longest distances. We've worked with Lyft, the ride-sharing company that is now committed to have their fleet of 2 million vehicles all electric by 2030. I think we can do it earlier, but highlighting the economic benefit for drivers and the need to think about housing policy as climate policy. These are areas that bridge out of the science and bridge very strongly into the policy side of this story. And if we don't do it, we know that our tipping points worldwide will come quickly. We've already seen massive deforestation in the Amazon. The estimates are that when 20% of the Amazon goes from rainforest covered to deforested to move to areas producing soy, that we may see a tip where the Amazon goes from being a sink for carbon to a source. And the estimates are highly likely that in the coming years, under the policies of President Bolsonaro, that this may happen. So we have biological tipping points. We know that from a justice perspective, the poorest people around the planet do not have access to stable supplies of drinking water. We saw the Cape Town disaster happen last year. These are further examples of if we don't integrate in justice for minority groups, for women, for underrepresented tribes in both poor countries. We often speak of this for parts of, for example, sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, but for rich countries. We have poor communities in the United States. We have poor communities in Western China where we underinvest. That has to change. Here in California, you saw our fires last year. The signs of wear a mask with these horrible fires and these very high particulate levels. These are micrograms per cubic meter. I live right here, very high levels. And here is my solar panels in last June. Here's my solar panels in September when the wildfires cut our air quality so that the production from my solar went down and down and down to almost nothing at the peak of our mini climate catastrophe. The story for investing in poor countries is something where I believe President-elect Biden will re-energize. The Belt and Road in China has to play a much different role of investing in poor communities, investing in clean energy in those areas. And we see some signs. We've seen efforts to build more distributed solar, more wind instead of large dams, for example, in the Mekong. This is a paper we published last year in Nature. And in one of the big battles, my team is engaged with the government of Kenya that was considering a coal-fired power plant to go on the coast, despite the fact that Kenya has some of the best geothermal in the world, excellent solar and wind. So we did the technical analysis, but again, science was the start, it wasn't the end. The social movement in Kenya to not build that coal plant is strong, and the battle using the kind of science we did and the community organization finally got the two funders, General Electric from the United States and the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, to finally withdraw their investments from that coal plant. So we have hope, but the real challenge is we're going to have to move this science much more quickly, because all of those climate graphs that we're so used to seeing that look at the high path that I began this talk with and the green path still don't fully take into account all the feedbacks from those tipping points. So if we don't science the blank out of it, we don't open up our opportunities to make this set of optimistic pathways, not optimism, but actual routes to bring down our emissions. That's really the challenge we're at. I want to thank you for letting me speak, and I look forward to the last minutes of conversation here. So thank you so much, and let me pass it back to you, SK.